Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here. Big news, all the holidays are canceled. All of them, they're all canceled. A school board in Randolph, New Jersey, it's about 90 minutes west of Manhattan, voted unanimously to remove the names of all the holidays from the calendar. Every holiday, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Memorial Day, dare I even say it out loud, Columbus Day, are now just labeled day off. It's all just day off. I have a ton more to say about this story that we're going to do on tomorrow's show, so stay tuned for a deep dive into that. But this is another example of one of our themes from last week, which is rewriting the past. Those who control the present control the past. Those who control the past control the future. And the left today clearly controls the present, and they are rewriting the past. And as we'll talk about tomorrow, eliminating it. And then when it's eliminated, they can fill it in with whatever they want. I'll give you another example of rewriting the past. A law professor, University of Buffalo, has edited down a Supreme Court decision for his students because it's just too traumatic. 1857, the Dred Scott decision. It was a terrible decision. It was a ruling that this slave, Dred Scott, did not have a right to sue because he was a slave and technically, therefore, not a citizen. So this law professor has narrowed down this historical moment, this history-making clearly decision, and edited it down just to 2 paragraphs because it's too. He said, it's just painful. I'm white, and I'm going to stand up there and talk with the students, including black students, about this stuff. I would be dragging them through stuff that was hurtful to them. Why were they slaves? It just felt indefensible. He says it gratuitously traumatizes students. I wasn't comfortable giving his words, the Chief Justice, to my students because I was afraid it would hurt them and destroy the kind of community that I want to foster in class. This is not just him. There's a lot of law professors who will not teach any classes involving rape because it's just too traumatic for adults, for law students. So the bottom line here is if you are traumatized by reading about bad Supreme Court decisions, then you should not be in law school. And also, how are you even a functioning human being on a day-to-day basis, quite frankly? But the second thing, the most important thing, the Dred Scott decision is supposed to disturb you. Or I should say, it should. You should read it and say, wow, that was terrible. And did you catch the key word I just said there? The key word is was. That was terrible. That's where this Dred Scott decision is where we were. And now look how far we've come that I, a black person not too long ago, 150 years ago, wasn't even allowed to sue in court. And now here I am in law school. That's amazing, isn't it? That's incredible progress in a short period of time. By the way, you want to know who would want you to read the Dred Scott decision? Dred Scott would want you to read. Dred Scott would want you in law school to be standing up saying, thank you, Dred. Thank you for fighting the system the best way that you possibly could, for never giving up. Dred Scott was born into slavery in Virginia. His masters moved to Alabama and then to Missouri, and he was sold to another person who dragged him all around the country with him. He was a slave, and then maybe wasn't a slave, and then was taken back as a slave. He lived a terrible life. So thank you, Dred, for fighting for your freedom, and therefore all slaves' freedom. Dred Scott would want you to read the Dred Scott decision, you whining little pansy. Could you imagine this man, who was a slave nearly his entire life, sitting in that law school classroom, watching all students, but in particular in this case, as this professor is talking about, black students distraught, at just hearing his story? Surely Dred Scott would say, are you kidding me? You pathetic little children. You can't even hear my story. I lived my story and still was strong enough to stand up and fight. You can't even sit there in law school and hear it. You think listening to my story is traumatizing to you? How do you think it felt to me? I couldn't even sue. So listen to this decision, the entirety of this decision, and imagine me hearing it. I didn't give up. Imagine how traumatizing it was for me and my wife and my 2 daughters to hear this decision, while you and your privileged, comfortable law school self, law school state, can sit there and be like, I don't want to hear it. It's too hurtful. Oh. Amazing. You would think these law school students, you think they'd hear this case and erupt in cheers of applause. Thank you, Dredd. You lost that round, but we won the war. Thanks for fighting. But instead, they get in a fetal position and whine about how terrible their life is. It's pathetic. Now, the real truth is, if you want to go another step deeper, and this is one of my favorite points from Jordan Peterson, when you read the Dred Scott decision, don't think of yourself as Dred Scott. Don't imagine yourself as Dred Scott. Oh, the poor victim. I'd be just like him. Oh, I'm so victimized too. No. Imagine yourself as this guy. That's the Chief Justice who wrote this decision, right? When you read the Dred Scott decision, you're him. Read it, and this is true with all history. Read it as if you're the bad guy. You have to read history as if you were the one doing the bad things in the story. And you would have written it exactly as he did. If you don't view it that way, you're not reading history properly, and you have far too prideful of a view of yourself. Anyway, back to my main point. You'd think black law school students would focus on the was, how terrible this decision was, and then be grateful for how far we've come. But you can see how you can't realize how far you've come until you realize how bad things once were. So this effort to erase the past, and think about it like this. Let me explain it this way. You'd think the critical race theory people would want to say how bad things were for black people, but they don't. The goal of critical race people, activists, is to say how bad things are for black people. If you teach how bad things were, then people will realize, hey, things are way better than that. Wow, I'm really grateful for that. No. We can't have gratitude. That's the worst thing possible. We can only have bitterness and anger. That's what the critical race theory people feed on. That's what they give to them. They want bitterness and anger. Gratitude's the antidote to that. So the critical race theory activists, they don't teach history. I mean, Hannah Nicole, what's her name? The Jones, or the critical race, the 1619 Project person. Her name's escaped me anymore. She says, I'm not a historian. I'm not a historian. They're not historians. They don't teach history. Anytime they talk about an historical event like the Tulsa Race Massacre, they just quickly gloss over it and then get to the how people are still, nothing's changed. People still feel the legacy of slavery today, right? They quickly go into how things aren't any better than they were even back then. And that's obviously not true, but they can't let a little hint of gratitude get in the way of their bitterness and anger. We talked with a black woman from Tulsa on this show last Thursday maybe, and I asked her, I said, should we teach the Tulsa Race Massacre from 100 years ago? And she said, oh, of course we should, as closure. Meaning that was then. It's not now. But that's not what the critical race theory people do. They're not in the business of closure. They're in the business of opening up old wounds of bitterness to justify reparations and ultimately the end of capitalism. Because that's what the point of all this Marxist stuff is. It's to tear down capitalism. There's no better way to end a show than with the great Thomas Sowell. Enjoy.
I noticed something, a column that you wrote, this is a couple of years ago, in which you rebutted Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times. And Kristof had ascribed the gaps between African Americans and whites in America, gaps in wealth, gaps in educational achievement, the usual gaps, to, and this is a quotation from Kristof, to the lingering effects of slavery, close quote.
Oh, yes.
And here's Tom Sowell, quote, if we wanted to be serious about evidence, we might compare where blacks stood 100 years after the end of slavery with where they stood after 30 years of the liberal welfare state. In other words, we could compare hard evidence on the legacy of slavery with hard evidence on the legacy of liberals. Close quote.
If there's anything better than ending a segment with Thomas Sowell, it's someone else reading a quote from Thomas Sowell while Thomas Sowell chuckles in the background. Don't let the left erase history. I'm going to talk about that more coming up next, because if you erase history, then of course you repeat it. So up next, we'll talk about one aspect of history repeating itself, and it's maybe the worst of, at least certainly, the history of the 20th century. It's the worst part of the 20th century, and we are repeating it right here in America. We'll talk about that coming up next. Also coming up later in the show, we're going to talk about inflation. Imagine when everyone's money is worth nothing, and when people literally don't have enough money to buy food. And add on top of that, when people's 401ks are worth half of what they were yesterday, there's going to be a lot of panic, a lot of freaking out. COVID was nothing compared to that. But you see how easily people turn into sheep, right? And panicked sheep are even worse. I don't want to deal with people at that time in that space. Or if I do want to help people, right? Yeah, you can't. If you're one of them, if you're someone standing in line at the grocery store all day to buy bread, you're not in a position to help anyone. My Patriot Supply has everything you need for emergency food preparedness. Get the 4-week supply. That's like a 4-week supply of food is just being an adult. That's just like having car insurance, or what? It's just like a thing you do as an adult. They also have a 1-year supply. That's if you're a baller. But you got to at least get the 4-week supply. They also have seeds and microgreens, which are awesome. And then anything else you need for emergencies. Emergency blankets, flashlights, water filtration. They have it all. My Patriot Supply is definitely the best. There's no doubt about it. We have a special website for you. Preparewiththefirst.com. Preparewiththefirst.com. And you get, among other deals, 25% off their 4-week supply. So just check that off the list. Everyone else is panicking. You and your family are going to be calm, safe, and well-fed. Preparewiththefirst.com. Spread the word. Listen, it's become a cliche. It's become trite, but it's true. History repeats itself. And if you don't learn the mistakes of history, it will repeat itself. Like, we know that it's a truism as well as being trite. We need to listen to people who have lived through these histories. Last week, we played a clip of a woman who grew up in Mao during the Cultural Revolution. She says, hello, this same stuff is happening. Here, so she was at a school board meeting. She crushed it in her 60-second statement. Here she goes, a little deeper.
I want people to see there's similarities, and the similarities are terrifying. They use the same ideology and same methodology, even the same vocabulary, and with the same goal. The ideology is cultural Marxism, and we were divided into groups as oppressor and oppressed. And here we use race, and there they use class. I just want people to know that the freedom is fragile, and we can lose it anytime if we don't defend it. And there's a lot of Chinese Americans who have the same experience and share my point of view. And I know that more and more people will step up and share their stories and tell the American people critical race theory is not anti-racism. It itself is racist. It's divisive, it's destructive, and it is dangerous.
All right.
Good for her. Okay, you ready for this segment? There's a question going around in certain circles. Could a genocide against white people happen here in America? The Cultural Revolution that she lived through in China killed up to 20 million people. That's a lot. Now, there's a lot of arguments as to why nothing like that could ever happen here in America. Okay? A lot of arguments why that could never happen here. There's a lot of guns in America. Also, white people are the majority. Can you have a genocide against a majority of the people? So they say, oh, it could never happen. There's also a lot of interracial marriage in America. About 15% of all marriages are interracial. So the racial animosity that's being pumped into our culture could never really ultimately turn family against family, right? Right? Maybe those people are right. Maybe we're different. Yeah, we're different here in America. Maybe we're the first people ever where a constant drumbeat of hatred and envy won't boil over into systemic violence. Or I should say systematic violence. Yeah. I hope they're right. I'm not sure they are. I hope they are. Either way, the stuff I'm going to share with you next few minutes here is pretty concerning, no matter where you think it ends up. This is Yale Med School, the Yale Med School Child Study Center. Right? There's a couple gems here. We have the audio of it, but it was over Zoom, so it's of really bad quality. So this is the talk this woman gave. This is the cost of talking to white people at all. The cost of your own life as they suck you dry. There are no good apples out there. White people make my blood boil. Around 5 years ago, I took some actions. I systematically white ghosted most of my white friends. I mean, just cut them out of our life. I had fantasies of unloading a revolver into the head of any white person that got in my way, burying their body and wiping my bloody hands as I walked away, relatively guiltless with a bounce in my step, like I did the world a blanking favor. The speech was called The Psychopathic Problem of the White Mind. A little projection there, lady. All right, so it's not just her. There's this other guy wrote in a medical journal. All right, so this is an actual medical journal paper here. Sorry, we have it up on the screen here if you guys want to pop it up. I'm pulling it up here. Here it is. Whiteness is a condition one first acquires and then one has. A malignant, parasitic-like condition to which white people have a particular susceptibility. Parasitic whiteness renders its hosts' appetites voracious, insatiable, and perverse. These deformed appetites particularly target non-white peoples. Okay, that was an actual paper in a real-life medical journal. This is a seminary professor in Georgia, black woman, and she wrote this devotion in a New York Times best-selling devotional book. There's a lot of different people that submitted their devotions, and this was this woman's devotion submission. You ready for this? Dear God, please help me hate white people. At least I want to stop caring about them individually and collectively. By the way, there's no turn in this. There's no, at the end of this story, there's no like, that would be the prayer of a terrible person. No. This is it. I want to stop caring about their misguided racist souls, to stop believing that they can be better. Racist. Lord, if it be your will, harden my heart. You can just go buy this at Target, this devotional. Stop me from striving to see the best in people. Stop me from being hopeful that white people can do and be better. Let me imagine them instead as white hooded robes standing in front of burning crosses. Okay. Now you could replace white there with Jew, and we've seen this movie before. Replace the word white with black, And we've seen that movie before. Not a good movie. I'd like to stop this from replaying over and over. But if you say that you don't want this history to repeat itself, you're deemed the racist. Amazing. So these views are all allowed on college campuses, Yale Med School. They're allowed in actual scientific medical journals, and they're allowed in Christian devotionals. That's pretty mainstream. Conservative speakers, by the way, not welcome in any of those places. The person who says we're all the same race is deemed the racist. Okay, back to my point. So genocide. So I'll grant you, perhaps you believe, or perhaps one could believe that genocide is too strong of a word. That would never happen here. Okay. There's a teacher at a super prestigious or expensive prep school outside of Manhattan. It's in New Jersey, but it's right outside Manhattan. She resigned. She did a big public resignation. She made a video about it all. She says her students have been trained. She was an English teacher, high school English teacher. She said her students have been trained their entire lives now, when they read a story, to find the oppressor and the oppressed, and then to view themselves as the oppressed. One 8th grader told her that there was a different English teacher who said this teacher made all the white kids feel like horse blank, like worthless scum, undeserving of living, all because they're white. So, I don't know, maybe teaching generations of kids to hate each other because of their race won't lead to violence. So let's talk about how it will definitely make life worse. Okay, so genocide again, the mass rounding up of white. Okay, fine. Maybe you think it's too. Maybe you think it'll never happen here. Fine. But let's talk about where it is happening and where bad things are happening now that will affect your life. Bari Weiss wrote a wonderful article about wokeness in medicine. And she had this great quote. She said, "I always thought that if you lived through a revolution, it would be obvious to everyone. As it turns out, that's not true. Revolutions can be bloodless, incremental, and subtle. And they don't require a strong man. They just require a sufficient number of well-positioned, true believers and cowards." So she's been writing about doctors in hospitals and universities who are concerned about this woke takeover of medicine. One of the quotes in her article, she said, this person said, people are afraid to speak honestly. Who is this person? This person was a doctor in the Soviet Union. He said it's like back in the USSR where you could only speak to the ones you trust. We should listen to the people who fled from the Soviet Union. We should listen to the people like that woman that we played at the top of the segment who fled from communist China. And when they say, this looks familiar, we should listen to them. Another person in Bari Weiss's article said, wokeness feels like an existential threat. Existential threat to what? To medicine, to healthcare, to scientific research. Whoa. One doctor said whole research areas are off limits. What? All right, I have two examples of this, and they're opposites of each other, right? So Bari Weiss and the doctors she was meeting with, they talked about a study that was published last year in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And that article, or that medical paper, resulted in headlines like this. CNN, black newborns more likely to die when looked after by white doctors. Fortune, the lack of black doctors is killing black babies. The Guardian, black babies more likely to survive when cared for by black doctors, excuse me. And I'll cut to the chase here. This study was complete garbage. It was total garbage, but no one can say anything. Can't criticize it because the narrative, it fits the narrative, right? It's very similar to the people who say, black kids need to be taught by black teachers. And they're like, oh, that's absurd. There's no evidence that that's helpful or beneficial at all to anyone. That's a ridiculous concept. What if I, as a white person, said, ooh, I can't have my white kid taught by a black teacher. That's he's not going to learn as much. He needs to be taught by another white person. Like, that's absurd. But here it is, that same thinking applied to medicine. put out with this total bunks, ridiculous, horrific methodologically designed study, but no one can touch it. No doctor or researcher wants to criticize it because they'll be deemed a racist if they do. Now let's on the flip side, 2018, I'll never forget this story. Brown University, a researcher at Brown coined the term rapid onset gender dysphoria. So this is someone who, a kid, who I'm a boy, and then all of a sudden, boom, I think I'm a girl. And it's like, whoa, where did that come from? And this researcher concluded that a child may say that they're a different gender as a coping mechanism for other mental disorders or issues that they may have in their life. And that study was released, and within a week, that was shot down, deleted, scrubbed from Brown University as soon as the LGBTQ lobby got a hold of it and criticized it, and that was it. Entire areas of medical research are off limits. Now it gets even worse. One doctor who's older, see, there's a generational gap here when it comes to even in medicine. Well, all this stuff with wokeness, but when it comes to medicine as well. So this doctor says he heard a young doctor applying anti-racist principles in choosing how they allocate their time and which patients they choose to work with. I've heard examples of COVID cases in the emergency department where providers go, I'm not going to treat the white guy. I'm going to treat the person of color because whatever happened to the white guy, he probably deserves it. Michelle Morse, she's at Harvard Med School, and she's the chief medical officer of the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And she published an anti-racist agenda for medicine. And she said the goal is that doctors need to address discrepancies in healthcare outcomes. And in order to address that, hospitals should commit to, this is a quote, hospitals should commit to preferentially admitting patients who have been historically denied access to certain forms of medical care. That is, they should admit people to health services based on their skin color. That is racism. So, true story. Will this result in genocide? That's a lot. Maybe not. Will it result in a unified country? Certainly not. So the people who are pushing for division and hatred and envy, you got to ask, what is their end goal? And have they considered where this act has ended up when it's been tried in other countries? Maybe an act, but it's not a game. Just ask that woman in China who fled. Good thing she did. 20 million people were killed. But it could never happen here. True story. Mike Slater, we're talking about the G7 coming up next. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, the G7 summit was this past week. Perhaps you've seen some news about it. The G7 countries are us, United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, France, Germany, and Italy. Really the first big international world stage event that our president went to. And there were many a blunder. Let's just play one of them here. He is confusing Syria with Libya.
We could work together with Russia. For example, in Libya, we should be opening up the passes to be able to go through and provide food assistance and vital assistance to a population that's in real trouble. Russia has engaged in activities which we believe are contrary to international norms, but they have also bitten off some real problems they're going to have trouble chewing on. And for example, the rebuilding of Syria, Libya. They're there. So I'm hopeful that we can find an accommodation where we can save the lives of people for example, in Libya.
That's embarrassing. In his defense, Obama and Biden did drop bombs in both Syria and Libya, so I can see how maybe he would get them confused. Niall Gardner is here from the wonderful Heritage Foundation. Mr. Gardner, how are you, sir?
Doing very well. Thank you very much, Mike, for having me on the show today.
Good to talk to you. But besides the goofiness there, what happened? Fill me in. What are some good headlines of what happened at the G7 summit?
Well, as you mentioned, Mike, this was Joe Biden's first big international trip. I have to say it wasn't exactly a very inspiring trip. In fact, I think Joe Biden was sort of sleepwalking his way across Europe, and he's now, of course, attending the NATO summit in Brussels. And the G7 summit really did very little at all, I think, to advance any kind of robust U.S. leadership on the international stage. As we saw earlier, certainly Joe Biden was very confused when he was discussing Russian foreign policy in both Syria and Libya. It's the demonstration of the kind of faux pas that Biden makes increasingly now, both at home and abroad. And in many respects, I thought that Joe Biden was clearly out of his depth in some of these meetings, clearly losing track of what was going on. He had to be corrected on a number of occasions by Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, who was hosting the summit. And of course, Biden began the summit by insulting the United Kingdom, America's closest friend and ally, by lecturing the British about their stance on Brexit and Northern Ireland. And there was a furious reaction in London to Biden's approach on this. And it's absolutely appalling, I think, when you have a US president telling the British people about their own democratic decisions. And that's not the right way to go about being the leader of the free world, I think.
It's on your first point, I'd like to get back to that second one. On this first point about, it's one thing to be old Joe and kind of make a couple goof ups here and there. But as you said, out of his depth and unable to keep up and focus on what was really happening here. What are these world leaders, and what have you seen these world leaders react, either in front of the cameras, or how do you imagine they're reacting behind the scenes to America's leadership?
Well, I think there's certainly a sense in Europe that Joe Biden's not as tough as Donald Trump, and that of course is being taken advantage of by some European leaders. I think Vladimir Putin is eagerly looking forward to his summit meeting with Joe Biden on Wednesday, because he views Biden as weak-kneed, whereas I think Donald Trump was a far tougher adversary for the Russian president. Also, certainly European Union leaders who were present at the G7 summit also think that Joe Biden is somebody who they can do business with. He's not as aggressive, certainly, as Donald Trump. And I think that Biden is seen as somebody who can be taken advantage of, actually, by some countries on the international stage. That's certainly as well how China looks at the Biden presidency. We didn't see a lot of strength and resolve coming from President Biden on this European trip. Europe is deeply divided over this issue. You need to have strong U.S. leadership in the face of both Moscow and Beijing. You're not seeing that from Joe Biden, really. He simply doesn't lead. He's following the Obama leading from behind approach, which isn't exactly the right message to send when you're the leader of the free world, really.
Now, let's put those into two categories, actually. Let's talk about Moscow and Beijing. We'll talk about Russia and China. But first, how could Biden, and therefore America, be taken advantage of by our European allies, right? If America doesn't take the lead or doesn't have a strong voice at the table, what would the Europeans do that you believe would be at, not in America's best interest, and then ultimately potentially not even in the world's best interest, if we don't take that leadership role?
Yeah, I think that in terms of the European Union, the EU is very weak in the face of China, especially. It's very divided. And you recently had a major investment deal between Brussels and Beijing. You need a US president to basically convey the message to our European allies that they need to be a lot tougher in the face of the Chinese threat. As far as I can tell so far, I mean, Joe Biden doesn't have any kind of coherent overall strategy with dealing with Beijing. And when the US president doesn't lead, then you have all sorts of disarray in Europe. You have the appeasers who are keen to do deals with Beijing, gaining the upper hand. And I think that what you have seen in the last few months is confusion in Europe over the US position with regard to both Russia and China. This is giving an opportunity for those European leaders who want to see an appeasement approach being implemented. That includes the Germans, who have been, I think, very, very weak in terms of standing up to both the Russians and the Chinese. And Germany is the biggest economic power in Europe today. So I think that, you know, Biden sends confusing messages. It doesn't help in terms of strengthening the transatlantic alliance. And you know, we need to have US leadership on the world stage. We're not seeing that at the moment with Biden.
What good could possibly come out of meeting with Putin on Wednesday? Give us a little preview on that. What is the best case scenario? What's the goal of this meeting? Because he is just going to be outstrengthed, no question.
Yeah, I don't think anything good is going to come out of this meeting with Putin. And Putin is a master operator in these kinds of meetings. He will see it as a strategic game of chess. And you know, Biden, I think, doesn't have the ability, frankly, to stand up to Vladimir Putin. Putin really wanted this summit because he knows that Biden is lacking in resolve and conviction. Biden's exactly the kind of leader that Putin wants to deal with, because he thinks that Biden is a pushover. And Biden, for example, has been a huge pushover over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And Biden's refusal to sanction this pipeline has sent a tremendous message of weakness to Moscow. And you know, the Russians could write the script, frankly, for the Biden administration's policy over Nord Stream 2, which is basically throwing US allies in Eastern and Central Europe under the bus. It's a disgraceful approach. And Putin is loving every minute, I think, of what Biden is doing with regard to Nord Stream 2. He wants more of that. And I expect you'll see more of that at the summit on Wednesday.
We got about 30 seconds. What was anything good that came out of the G7 summit for the world? You
know, I can't think of anything really constructive that came out of this G7 summit. And on the economic side, I think it was disastrous, with a lot of big government proposals. And the Biden presidency is the most left-wing US presidency in history, and that's reflected in US foreign policy and in its broader economic policy, which does not embrace economic freedom or free markets.
Not good, and looks like it's going to get worse. Niall Gardner from the Heritage Foundation. Thanks, Mr. Gardner. Appreciate your insight.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Have a wonderful day. Coming up next, we'll talk about AMC stock, but there's a bigger lesson learned here, to note here. And we'll also come back and talk about inflation and what that's going to mean for all of us. It's bad. Coming up next, true story. Mike Slater, spread the word. I can't believe we're actually going to talk about this here. I will put my own personal demise aside. I bought AMC stock like right when the pandemic started at $2. I sold it at $9. It's now at 58. Carol Roth is here, author of The War on Small Business, How the Government Used the Pandemic to Crush the Backbone of America. Carol, how are you today?
Fantastic, and you didn't have those, as they call them, diamond hands, Mike. That's the people who are what they call hodling. You got to hodl the stock.
I know. I didn't go anywhere near the moon on AMC. I so crapped out, and it's my own fault. So what do we do with this, Carol? Because there's a big question here. Like, how much of this? What do we do if we live in a world where our stock market is based not off of like the fundamentals of a company, but instead turns into like this video game based off of memes and animal spirits and just how we're feeling today and Saturday Night Live and Elon Musk's latest tweets? What do we do with that?
Yeah, so I think there are two pieces of it. One is that unfortunately, a lot of people in the media have dismissed this as sort of a joke, and people are making jokes on the internet, and those become memes. And that's not at all what's happening. This is, as some of the folks, and some of them call themselves the ape army, and some of them are just online retail investors. But this is really a digital Occupy Wall Street 2.0. We have a lot of people, whether it's retail investors, people on Main Street, small businesses who feel disenfranchised, and they feel that everything from the market to the economy is rigged against them. So they're going out and they're sussing out places where they feel like there has been unfairness. And if you come up to something like AMC, this is a beloved brand. They feel like it was unfairly attacked. Same thing with GameStop. And in some cases, they feel like there are pseudo-legal practices called naked shorting. Naked shorting is itself illegal. Market makers have a loophole to do it, where you can borrow a share and have that same share borrowed many, many times to sell it. So you're actually selling something that not only you don't own and you don't allocate it. And they feel like this is unfair, not only to these companies, not giving them a fair chance to be able to raise money in the markets, but also not fair to the overall market and retail investors. So it's really broader like that. That being said, you want to talk about what's really inflating and rigging the market. It's not the Elon Musk, it's the Federal Reserve and the $7.9 trillion that they have sitting on their balance sheet that they have pumped into the market to completely dislocate risk. So that's the bigger concern, is what's going on with the government, with their cronies, that's moved us from free market capitalism to, like you said, this kind of like insane cronyism where like we can't even rely on valuation anymore.
Yeah, no. So that's my first question is like, well, you know, it used to be based off of these and it's like, was it really ever?
It was.
Especially with the Fed in the game.
I'm a recovering investment banker, so I know this. I've built models. I used to go into the market and you'd be able to say, this amount times cash flow or this times revenue. And over, really the past decade and a half, particularly on the outside of the Great Recession, as you've had the Fed come into the market, it's gotten completely blown out to the point where, it's hard to even give financial advice.
Is this good where we're at right now? Like the ape army and all the rest with the diamond hands into the moon and doing all this stuff on Reddit and stuff. Is there a good end to this, or does it end in ultimate demise?
Well, I think it's good that we have people who are pushing back, and they're pushing back in a more specific and intentional way. I think when we had the last Great Recession, there was a lot of truth to the issues that people had, but it was done in a way that was such a mess that, it's hard to know what it was that people were talking about. But at this point, it's imperative that we have all of these individuals, that we have all of the small businesses stand up and say things like rein in the Fed, bring more transparency to the markets, stop telling big businesses that they're essential and small businesses they're not essential. Because A, there's more of us than there are politicians. And if we do it, we're just going to see this continued consolidation of power. I mean, last year, Mike, 7 tech companies gained $3.4 trillion in value, while hundreds of thousands of small businesses closed, millions more were hurt, people were out of work. That is a major disconnect, and that was driven by the Fed and the government.
Has there ever been a greater, if you will, transfer of wealth, intentional destruction of the lower and middle class and growth of the upper class than this in world history?
No. This is historic. And if you look at the amount that has been transferred, I mean, it's bigger than the output of many countries, right? We're talking trillions of dollars. And like you said, it's very much intentional. When COVID first happened, what was the first thing that happened? They propped up the stock market. They didn't reach out to the backbone of the economy. That tells you all you need to know.
Got this number here. 37.5% of small businesses in the U.S. have been lost due to lockdowns and other interventions. What's that number based off of? And like that's a ridiculous number. A third of small businesses shut down. Is that how I'm interpreting that?
So yeah, so I've seen this chart go around, and I think the reality before COVID there was 30.2 million small businesses, and 6 million of those had employees. I don't believe that 10 million or so small businesses have been shut down permanently. Probably hurt. But that could be just an employer-based number. So it could be maybe 2 million or something, which again is insane. If you think about, there's only about 10,000 big businesses. So one of the challenges when we come to talk about small businesses, because there's so many of them and they're so dispersed geographically and by industry, a lot of people don't have the expertise. So they take like a slice of them and they give these numbers. But I do think that it makes a point, whether it's consumer-facing businesses that have storefronts, employer-based businesses, any big swath of that is unacceptable, especially when it was done by government mandate. They said, you're not essential, you don't have the political clout, but if you do, we're going to make sure you're taken care of. And government picking winners and losers is always going to end up in the small guy losing.
I'm grateful you're putting a spotlight on this because I don't think the full story's been told yet. The war on small businesses, how the government used the pandemic to crush the backbone of America. Carol Roth. Thanks, Carol. Awesome to talk to you as always.
Thanks for the platform. Appreciate it.
Have a wonderful day. It's going to be such a shame when every restaurant in America is Chipotle. True story. Mike Slater. We'll do it again tomorrow. Spread the word.